Hey everyone, welcome to the Annexapod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 11 for February 1st, 2017. I'm your host, Ned Bellevants, Enterprise Architect for Infrastructure Solutions at Anexinet. And here on the Annexapod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we'll be talking about what's new in storage for Windows Server 2016 with Ned Pyle, Principal Program Manager at Microsoft. How you doing, Ned?
Hello, Ned. It's awesome to say Ned.
Yeah, it throws me through a bit of a loop.
Ned.
Yeah,
it's really weird. I was trying to think of the last time I've actually spoken to someone named Ned, and I can't remember. It's got to have been decades.
It's probably been about 4 years for me. There was a Ned at a client that we were doing work for, and I met him once, and we had the same sort of like, whoa, this is kind of weird reaction.
That's what happens when you have this like 19th century name.
Yeah, how about it? So, first question, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Microsoft.
Well, I am a program manager here, and what that really means is I like to say that we have developers who develop and testers who test and PMs do everything else. So we fill in a lot of the gaps on the actual project management parts to some extent of making new features and scenarios and workloads within Windows Server, but also a lot of customer work, a lot of our own testing and sort of user acceptance work, design stuff, or complain about our own current and work on fixing it for the future. Some of us have dev backgrounds that can actually go and do small aspects of that. Most don't. I often get utilized for things like diagnosability and things of that nature because I spent years at Microsoft in support as an escalation engineer before deciding that I just couldn't get yelled at by another customer one more time. I had to switch. So I've been here for about 12 years total at Microsoft, about the last 4.5 years as a PM. Before that, 8 years of support where I worked mainly in Active Directory. And then also I, before that, was in consulting and, just roaming around the country doing IT stuff in the early 2000s and the 90s. And before that, I was an infantryman in the Marine Corps.
Wow, okay, good stuff. So it sounds like you were supporting Active Directory in its very early days.
Yeah, I actually got into AD right when it was in its beta phases. And I just sort of, like all things in my life, I sort of lucked and backed into working at Microsoft. I had worked on AD for a couple of years, and I had a friend who we were on contracts in North Carolina. I didn't realize that Microsoft had a very large site in North Carolina. At the time, I think it was the second largest site that they had in the country, maybe the world. And he was over there to do a year contract, and he's like, "Hey, you should come over. They're doing Active Directory stuff, and they're just backing up a truck. They have so many people just deploying AD for the first time. They just need everybody to come here and help all their customers." And after the year, he was gone, and I was still there. So it's those weird sort of scenarios that happen.
That sounds good, and you just kept rolling with whatever new and interesting came out, huh?
Yeah, the funny thing is, the reason I'm in storage now, and I've been in storage for a few years, is because I was on the beta for DFSR in 2005, 2004, and for weird reasons, idiosyncratic reasons inside of support, they have these boundaries and silos of support by workload and stuff, and DFSR didn't really fit anywhere, but because FRS was used by domain controllers, and there was a plan later on to use DFSR with domain controllers, they're like, well, DFSR will just be supported by the AD team. We got nowhere to put it. And I just happened to be like the one guy. I was sitting in a training room hearing about this new stuff. I'm like, that's kind of interesting, I guess. And nobody else said the same thing. So I just kind of fell backwards into that one and got interested in that and worked on it a lot until the point where when I was ready to move out of AD years later, the owner of DFSR, the manager of it, knew me and said, like, if you're interested, you could come out here to Redmond. And so it's weird stuff like that happens.
Yeah, well, I guess if you do good work, you get rewarded with more work, right? That's how it works.
Yeah. I regret ever answering his email, actually.
Well, I follow you on Twitter, and I notice that you seem to be very passionate about technology and also on your blog. What do you think is the driver behind that passion?
The main thing for me is, well, I have a few angles to this. One, my personal driver for technology is that I really like and enjoy working on cutting edge stuff, and I don't mean like in software, but I mean in humanity. Like, I probably would have been extremely passionate about internal combustion engines in 1899 or something like that.
Right.
I just find that interesting, and it's nice to work on something which is new and still kind of figuring itself out, and I'll probably be super bored of this, 5 or 10 years from now. The other thing is I like leaving sort of a mark and a little bit of proof that I ever existed. And one nice thing about being a program manager is almost everything you ever read and almost every sort of yes or no if a feature does this or that, or if it exists at all, comes from the PM side. So I like having a little bit of stuff to write on my tombstone that, most of my family, who I grew up a working class guy in a working class town, and everybody went to the factories and worked, and or small businesses and stuff, and their tombstone will just say, I'm beloved by 3 kids and a wife. And I was hoping mine would have a little bit of extra on top of that if I could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you want to move things forward and kind of be where the action is.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I feel that. Big announcement last year, Server 2016 went GA, and I hear it's got a few, kind of awesome features. Is there anything you want to highlight or tell me about?
Yeah. I actually, in that long list of stuff that my boss, who, lifted me out of Charlotte, does, is he decided early on that because I spent a lot of time doing big public presentations, I'm kind of a fixture at Ignite or TechEd or some of the other things like that, is that I should also be sort of one of the ambassadors of Server 2016. So unlike my team members, I also have the lucky job of learning about a bunch of stuff that I don't own and don't necessarily care about inside of 2016. I do a lot of presentations with executives and stuff like that. We have this beautiful briefing center here in Redmond. It's called the EBC, and you go into it, and it's like if you watched like a solidly funded TV show that's supposed to be set 10 years from now in the future, where every wall's got holograms on it and there's 3D printers going all over the place, and every time you turn around, somebody's handing you like a tiny little cup of espresso.
Right.
It's like that. And so I go there and I pitch stuff to customers all the time. Or maybe what I'm doing is just filling in their executives and C-levels on what we've done so that they even know the slightest thing about it, and then go back to decision makers and actual, technical people to decide what to do about it. But the thing that is, 2016 is an insane release for us. You mentioned 2000 before. I think it really is like that. It's like a watershed moment for Windows Server, the way that Windows 2000 was. Where 2000 you got Active Directory and all this stuff at once from nowhere, right? I mean, within Microsoft, from nowhere, they were all V1 features,
right?
And you get the same thing in 2016, whether it be shielded VM or storage replica or storage spaces direct or software defined networking or all these new pieces that show up. There's just this. I actually went and cataloged it. If you wanted to watch every single thing at Microsoft Ignite that we did last year in Atlanta about Server 2016, and you just went and watched the recordings one time, you would be watching for 72 hours.
72 hours of footage, huh?
Yeah, and that's just like, the tip your, toe in the water type stuff. Like, you can't go very deep in an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, so it's kind of nuts.
I attended Ignite 2016, and it was like Sophie's choice for every session. I was like, I wanted to go to 8 different sessions every time, and I just had to kind of pick a track and go with it. But there's so much good information coming out of there.
Yeah, it was insane. The one next year will actually be even bigger. And our own internal event that we run called Tech Ready has gotten so big that we this year are probably going to finally move it out of Seattle and move it, I think, to Vegas is what I'm hearing now. Wow. So we just couldn't hold it. The Washington Convention Center couldn't hold it anymore.
Okay, so Vegas bound. That sounds nice.
Well,
maybe.
Going to work in Vegas is not the same as having a good time in Vegas.
That's a valid point.
But yeah, there's just so much stuff going on. If somebody says, like, I only have an hour, just tell me 3 things to go look at, I would definitely say go look at Shielded VM, which is really a a feature that's just busting wide open the whole virtualization scenario, where I think for the first time ever in the history of Hyper-V or VMware or ANI or Zen or KVM or any of those products, like truly securing the VM for the first time. And the scenario we're trying to protect against is, right now it's very trivial just for somebody to copy a VHD onto, or a VMDK onto a thumb drive and just take it home.
Right.
And no one's the wiser. It's a very passive operation. The idea of shielded VM is not just to encrypt a VM. That's the easy part, and everybody can do that. It's to also make it so that only the tenant has control of the VM. Like it basically assumes that you don't trust the fabric or the hypervisor or the admins running the data center anymore, which is really the key to it. So it does a lot of layers of protection there and has a guardian service that makes sure that there's no hanky-panky going on and no one's attaching debuggers and no one's, trying to add their own drivers to intercept stuff. And then it makes it so that the actual owner of the VM is the one creating this, sort of sealed packet of data in order to build VMs. The entire process is controlled with a certificate and a key that only the owner of the VM has. It's pretty slick. And then if say that's shielded VM, I would say the next one is Storage Spaces Direct, where you have, for the first time, like properly hyper-converged storage inside a Windows server. That feature is, you take a bunch of servers, you throw some storage into them, the servers themselves join and become an array of drives or disks or both. And it has incredibly fast performance. It uses SMB3, which is a protocol that I own. I own a few things. I own SMB. I own Storage Replica. I own sort of the file server as a scenario, and as well as some software, the scale-out file server. And then I also own DFSR and FRS. I own a lot of replication technologies. And then I also own network access protocols. So the hyperconverged scenario has obviously been very hot in the industry for a while. This is our first iteration. But the nice thing about it is you're getting a bunch of excellent work from, a large company that has the backing to stay in business. You'll have already noticed that a bunch of hyperconverged companies have gone out of business very quickly because it's like any hot startup market, a bunch of them will just wither and die. And you hope that you're not betting wrong. As several have been acquired in the last, few months and weeks, and then obviously, the giant 8,000-pound gorilla is now the EMC VMware Dell merger, where you have this sort of, mega storage virtualization server corp. You might start getting nervous that, boy, that's an awful lot of power concentrated in one spot from a purchasing standpoint. And some customers will be like, wow, that's great. I mean, I love it. I love only writing one check. Other customers, might be sort of the opposite.
Right, yeah. My concern with that is, do I want one vendor who owns my hardware and my software and my solution? And my other big concern is they have about 5 different competing hyperconverged products in their portfolio. So what if I pick the one that they decide to let die on the vine while they're developing the other 4?
Yeah, how many storage solutions are owned by Dell, VMware, and EMC individually? They each... EMC acquired companies for years, so I think they actually have you could argue they have 5 or 6 SANs that are completely unrelated.
Easily, yeah.
That just, so it's going to be, and then, when that kind of thing happens, you're exactly right. The sort of let's consolidate and start slashing out, fat is going to mean that a bunch of stuff might just vanish. I mean, we'll see. The guys who run those 3 companies, we've worked with them for years here, and they are partners of ours as well as competitors. They're not dopes. And they're not malicious, and they're not jerks.
Right.
It's just sometimes it just comes down to economics.
Yeah, they have a business to run, and they have to make decisions that profit them and their shareholders if they have shareholders, which I guess Dell doesn't at the moment.
Yeah, it'll be interesting times to see. And it'll be interesting to see what all the other server and hardware vendors do, against they suddenly have this everybody was on a fairly even playing field for a long time. There's a bunch of SAN vendors and a bunch of server vendors and a bunch of virtualization vendors, and now they were never concentrated in one spot until now. So it'll be interesting to see how the market sort of competes.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the other one you mentioned was Storage Replica, which I've worked with Storage Spaces Direct a little bit in the lab, and that is awesome. But I haven't had a chance to mess around with Storage Replica. Can you tell me a little more about what that feature does and what scenarios it enables?
Sure. That's the one that I own. That's what I've been working on for the last 2.5 years. It's block replication brought into Windows Server for the first time, you've been able to buy something similar to this from SAN vendors for decades,
right?
Many decades. And this was us finally saying the block replication has got some very attractive features to it. I mean, you are allowed to replicate without worrying about files being in use or open. You can do synchronous replication. You're not worried about the semantics of the file system at all. So you can do extremely fast, super consistent replication. But we couldn't do that in Windows. We had a lot of asynchronous tools, and they were all pretty application specific, whether it was DFSR and FRS for me, which is just a file-based one. There was Hyper-V replica, what the name says it all. And you have SQL has a couple of different replication technologies, and Exchange has one. So you had all these little various options, but you didn't have the one that the industry actually, focuses on in storage, which is blocks. So we spent all that time cranking out a very fast, very scalable, and very agnostic system. And one of the reasons why I was brought into it was because we were operating in this, in the early time. We didn't really know what we were going to make, and we didn't really know what to do because the industry sort of, made these things years ago and didn't innovate after that, right? I mean, they all made sort of the same thing and sort of sat on it. So we did a few innovations that were different. But for the most part, what they were doing was right, and we agreed with it, and we went that route. So we do synchronous and asynchronous. Unlike if you buy a SAN, and then you have to go buy that vendor's replication to go with it, which is, of course, an a la carte pricing, and where a lot of the money gets made in storage is in the upsells of, software features. This just comes with Windows Server. So if you buy Server 2016 Data Center, you can replicate local storage, iSCSI targets, SAS or JBOD, SANs that are attached with LUNs, clusters, inside and between clusters, pretty much anything that you want other than like floppy drives. And I did definitely have one guy ask if he could replicate writable DVDs one time, which I thought was not a super awesome question to be asked. So, but it's both DR, obviously you want to keep copies of data either, fully available, synchronously available on another site or another building or another part of the campus or whatever. And then asynchronous if you want to go long range. The beauty of it is, it's really inexpensive because it comes with Windows Server. And even the most expensive version of Windows Server is not that expensive when you compare it to SAN pricing.
Right.
And the other thing is it's fairly simple to use. We thought about making sure that it was both easy to use through PowerShell as well as its cluster integration was fully done, so you could go through a wizard and clustering just like you would for anything else and just get used to it. You can do it with standalone servers. It's super flexible. And besides DR, it's also great for migrating. So we've actually got a sizable minority of customers who don't actually use it to protect data. They use it just to copy data like super fast between systems, sometimes between disparate systems, like two different SANs that they didn't buy replication software for, or
right.
Two different SANs that they couldn't buy it because they're from two different vendors, or just decommissioning a bunch of old servers and consolidating data onto a couple of new ones. It's nutty fast because you're not worried about files. It's all happening way down in the basement with a disk filter driver. I mean, we're very, very close to the storage itself when we're replicating. It's all kernel mode. There's nothing slow about it.
Okay. Does storage replica work in tandem with applications to quiesce them at all, or is it just always just doing the block level replication in the background?
Yeah, it's always going in the background. It doesn't really know about the application. It doesn't really know about the file system, to be honest. It doesn't really know what your file system is.
Right.
You could have Ntfs or RFS on there. This is not true for the log, but definitely for the data volume, the part that you're replicating. And I honestly don't know. If you were to put ext4 on there, I wouldn't be able to tell.
Right.
So, it doesn't have any real ties to the app. It's when it comes to waiting, and it's a great question, the waiting for quiescent data, it's crash consistent throughout. If you want app consistent snapshotting, which we don't provide in this version, we simply say, you still have VSS and shadow snapshots in Windows. Just periodically take them. The secret about those that most people don't know about is the snapshots are stored on the volume in this hidden folder, and that's going to replicate. So you are accidentally also replicating the snapshots when you create snapshots, and they'll be available to restore from if you were to have some kind of disaster and flip your source and destination storage over. They'd be sitting there ready to be restored to some point in time if you wanted to do it.
Right. So does Storage Replica work with Azure? Is there any kind of tie-in there?
Azure itself, no, not like in a native sort of service, but it does work in IaaS, and we're actually in the process right now of building some ARM templates. If your listeners are familiar with those, they're just a way to create and project out some libraries of VMs for certain workloads, so you don't waste time having to figure out how to make them.
Right.
It'll create you clusters or standalone servers that do replication just by pressing a button, basically. So you'll be able to do that in Azure. You can do it right now if you want to do it by hand. And you can do it between Azure and on-prem. So if you don't have a second data center, but you do have, I'd say a relatively decent connection, and you're willing to do asynchronous replication, you can certainly replicate from on-prem into an Azure IaaS VM.
Right. Yeah, we have a number of clients that either don't have a good DR location or are paying way too much for one. And so they've been looking at Azure Site Recovery as an option, but this sounds like this could be another potential option depending on their needs and how much they want to pay and if they want to put Express Route in and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, ASR is still there for Hyper-V replication. It's just that that's what it does. If you're not into Hyper-V and you want to replicate something else, you might go with SR.
Okay, cool. Are there any things that didn't make it into the 2016 RTM release that you would have liked to have seen?
With Storage Replica, the list is massive of the things I wanted to get in there. Probably the top ones that people ask about that have either already completed for the next release or we know we would be things like, can I have a test failover where I can mount the destination like in some scratch format and look at stuff and make sure that it's okay, whatever that means. No one can ever tell me what that means, but what I suspect they mean is they go open a few files and they seem to be readable, or they start a VM and it seems to boot. I never have any real understanding of what it means, but that's definitely something that we're going to pop out. That's sort of table stakes for some customers. I would love to have. We did some great compression work that just didn't make the line, so that we could, if you were doing async, we could really shrink the amount of data we're putting on the wire. Our goal was always to be as fast as possible. And honestly, we cared nothing about efficiency on the wire because everything was about performance. And of course, to certain customers, that's fantastic. And they want their data to be in sync. And that's the goal. And you can specify which networks you want to use with SR right now. So if you set aside a network for replication, we can say just use that network. We didn't have compression, and a bunch of, weaker networks started showing up, and people said, can you constrict this in some ways? We have some options. We can limit the bandwidth, and we can sort of slow it down artificially. But what I really wanted to do was just simply make it more efficient. So we designed that and tested it, and it works great. We just didn't ship it. Yeah,
that scenario of sort of the read-only or the copy, I could see that when I'm doing like a DR bubble test, and I'd like to enable, grab a snapshot of my replica, fire it up in a bubble, make sure that all of my components work in a DR test, but still have an active replication going on in the background. So if I had a real disaster, I'd still have a good replica in my DR site. So there's one very specific situation.
Precisely, and that's what we were doing. And we also are, we built in support with the ASR team. ASR supports replicating, through Hyper-V Replica, but they also replicate managing third-party replication, and they'll be managing, replicating, and orchestrating us. So we tie that into their run book and test failover stuff. They were one of our earlier customers, basically saying, you got to have this test failover thing. It's just a critical thing for us.
So that was Storage Replica. What about Storage Spaces Direct? Was there anything that didn't quite make the cut, or something we can look forward to getting bolted on?
The big thing about Storage Spaces Direct right now is, and it shipped, I think, it's been extremely popular, far more popular than its predecessor, which was just Storage Spaces.
Right.
It's already, I think it's probably sold better in the first month than I think Storage Spaces sold in its first year.
Wow.
But it's just sort of flying off the shelf. But it did not lack any of the core features we wanted. And it's a simple thing, right? You're building a storage system. There's only so much you could leave off the table, it reads and writes data and it doesn't break.
Right.
But the big thing that is an evolving process that's still going on right now is we created a new logo for it called Windows Server Software Defined. And Because here's the thing that you know and your listeners know and everybody in Windows knows, it's like the worst kept secret ever, is that Microsoft would make a bunch of stuff and we would say, this works great, and you'd try to run it and you're like, this runs like crap. And then we'd say, what are you talking about? It runs great for us. And we'd investigate and find out, like, oh, when you do this with this hardware and that vendor and you slap together this and that, it runs like crap. And then we did that for 25 years like crazy people. So a few years ago, we finally decided, like, this is ridiculous. And the appliance makers are gonna beat us with this over and over and over again. We have to get serious here. And what we did was built a new logo system that actually, we built tests for the vendors, stress tests, reliability tests, performance tests, all this stuff, which they have to run, and it takes days and days to run. It's not like some quickie driver verifier thing. It takes days. And basically it creates these real and synthetic workloads on top of their hardware, and they have to pass these tests. And once they pass these tests with their drivers and their firmware and their hardware, they are building a solution which they can resell packaged with this logo. And it can't be monkeyed with very much. So when you buy that system from them and it has this logo, you're basically getting a guarantee the same way you would from any other appliance maker, like, this is our solution running on our hardware. In this case, the hardware, let's say, is a Dell server or a cluster of Dell servers with, some drives and some firmware and some this and that. And when you put our stuff combined with their stuff, we promise you that Storage Spaces Direct will work great. And then you can buy these, out of the giant stable of all of Dell servers, you can buy 2 or 3 of these bundles, which are, specially logoed and tested, the way that you would buy from a smaller vendor who only makes a couple of appliances, but that's their whole bread and butter, right?
Right.
Like a Nutanix type or SimpliVity or one of those guys. So that's the biggest thing which is going on with Storage Spaces Direct is this logo program. Like, we announced it at Ignite, so a few months ago, and then it had been going on for a while, and it is going on now. And just, we did it for it's all the big guys. So Intel and Cisco and Dell and HP and Supermicro and Quanta and all those guys are all running around, certifying and logoing a handful of different, SKUs basically. And it's super time consuming. And of course we run into bugs and driver problems and we're helping them troubleshoot. So that's the part which is taking, I think, longer than we expected. Coming from being in the field for all those years and being in Microsoft support for all those years, it was sort of earth-shattering to find out when I got here to be a PM that this wasn't already the way it worked.
Right.
But I can promise you now that, like, when I first came here and was extremely unhappy to hear that's not how it worked, I'm very, very happy now to see that that's how it's going.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. I know, your performance may vary was always in the back of the mind, and so you had to work through these complex calculation scenarios and make sure that you're running these drivers, and if you found a bug, it would take a while. And now it sounds like, yeah, if I just buy the SKU from this vendor that has the logo on it, I know I'm going to get at least this minimum performance, and if I don't, I have someone who's going to help me fix it.
That's a great point. Is I would routinely, as the owner of file servers and scale-out file servers and SMB, I would routinely get a customer just showing up and saying, how many users can I run on this server or this cluster? I'm like, I have no idea. It's really embarrassing. I really don't have any good idea. It depends on like 80 million factors. And then now I can just say, go to their catalog and pick the one that says this many. So, it really simplifies my life. It really is. Honestly, if customers didn't like it, I'd still do all this because it makes my own life so much easier.
Right. So I think the other thing you mentioned that you own is SMB3. And I thought it was interesting that SMB is one of the things that Hyper-V uses as a native storage target. So why would you choose SMB over a block-based storage target like Fibre Channel or iSCSI?
The cool thing about SMB3 is that when we built it, and this honestly started before I became a PM. This was back for Windows Server 2012, many years ago. The name that was kept, SMB, and the port that was kept, both for compatibility reasons and for sort of marketing reasons. But under the covers, SMB3 shares effectively zero code base with SMB1 and only a small portion of the code base with SMB2. They actually kicked around the idea of renaming it to something else when 2012 came out because they wanted to prove they'd done all this great new work, and then the marketing folks were like, no, sorry. It's a brand here. You don't just change from Coke to something else.
Right.
So an argument was like SMB1 was more like, Crystal Pepsi, and like it's disgusting. We don't want to be associated with it, even though we own it. Right. But anyway, it's the idea behind it is we have this very flexible and very fast protocol that we've been working on to make sure that it's extremely lean for block copying. And then we were able to do a lot of very cutting-edge work. So we added multi-channel into it, which is not difficult. I mean, it's making sure that you use multiple networks and RSS to split up and use up as much of the network as you can. But then on the very much more cutting edge is, most storage systems use fiber channel because when block storage, became kind of a commodity in the 80s, that's what was around. We decided on RDMA. So remote direct memory copying stuff is what's been used by high performance and supercomputing for the last few years. They would never dream of using fiber channel because it's very expensive and it actually has, very low bandwidth. You have to add many, 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 many channels in order to get a significant amount of bandwidth that supercomputing and high-performance computing needed. So that was been kind of the thing for the last 10 years in other parts of the industry, and we said, well, let's go that route and build something that's a little bit more modern, a bit more flexible. So we met up with the Mellanox folks and the Chelsea folks and started exploring Rocky and what became Rocky V2 and InfiniBand and iWarp from Chelsea. We already have Ethernet, and we're extremely familiar with Ethernet here at Microsoft, so let's build an Ethernet-based system, which is very inexpensive to set up, but not only is cheaper, it is also much faster and as or lower latency, and then is much wider these days. I mean, the 100 gig Ethernet is now becoming common. 200 gig Ethernet is now becoming available, and for our customers, who want to set this up and do things like scale out or tie together a bunch of nodes to make storage spaces direct, you can spend a very small amount of money to get at least 25 gigabit of networking, between each node. I mean, just a trivial amount of money, like, Newegg money.
Right.
But not have any latency, and we needed a way to offload the processing, so we weren't, we're doing software-defined storage here. So we're making Windows be a storage appliance. We didn't want the CPUs just sitting there thinking about the networking the whole time. So we take all that and we offload it all into the NICs themselves, the RNICs. And so when we do a demo, I have a demo we run. It's a 12-node system that HPE provided us and Intel using Mellanox 100 gigabit. It's doing a terabit a second of the ideal workload of 4K read.
Right.
It's about 160 gigabytes a second, and it's only using across the aggregate amount of CPU across the cluster is 20%.
Wow.
The rest is available for workload. So it's a very fast but also pretty lightweight way of doing things. And then we're like, well, SMB3 it's great for doing scale outs. We can attach people to it like as if it were a LUN. We can put SQL on the end of that, and put compute in front of it. That makes it very flexible to do these sort of converged scenarios. And then we're like, well, SMB3 is working great there. Why don't we also use it for Hyper-V live migration because it's really fast? And then Storage Replica like me came around and we're like, well, the people have been using SMB3 this whole time. I know it's good because I'm one of the owners. It doesn't make any sense for me to create a whole new protocol when I've got one that moves data really fast. I need it to be fast. Let's use that. And I get all this stuff which takes years to develop, like RDMA and encryption and all this stuff for free. It just, so it became basically a go-to for us as a fabric. So we use it for, basically nowadays you have to convince somebody that you don't use SMB3 here, is the new argument.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned a bunch of things. First, the multipath protocol, which you said is very easy, but it seems to be very hard for everyone else. And
yeah, I mean, it's easy for us to, it's very easy if you just set up regular Ethernet networking and just like TCP. The instant you set up Rocky networking, here's the thing about RDMA networking and multi-channel stuff is you really have to get Rocky style, Ethernet, true Ethernet networking. You have to go back to the old days of flow control and DCB and VLAN tagging, and everything's got to be perfect because you no longer have TCP/IP taking care of all that crap for you anymore as a server owner. Chelseo and iWarp, I honestly typically recommend and prefer unless customers are going for the widest of bandwidth and the lowest of latency, because its operational and its setup cost is trivial. And even until you get to a very large amount of data pouring through it or a very shared network in a data center, you can just set it up and do nothing. And then if you have to, you probably end up only doing priority flow control, which is a fairly manageable thing to do. The problem with an Ethernet-based networking like RDMA is you've got to go back and be good at the basics again, and a lot of folks haven't had to do that in a long time. And what's worse is the networking folks who do know how to do it very well are not server administrators.
Right.
So they're not, so you have this two groups have to get together and figure it out together. So when you first set it up in a lab, it works great, and you try to push it out to 100 nodes, and you're wondering, like, who forgot to configure this one switch correctly? I'm going to murder them.
Yeah, I set it up in our lab doing Nano Server with Storage Spaces Direct, and the part that took probably the most mind power for me was getting the Rocky part correct on the servers and the switches, because I'm not a networking guy by trade, so I had to do a decent amount of reading just to understand what I was doing on the switch before I went and did it. So yeah, I wish they'd been iWarp servers. That would have been a lot easier, but.
There's a whole class of MVPs out there who I think exist only to get paid to help configure Rocky. So if you find you'll see those guys, and they're real big on Twitter and they're real big on the conference circuit, and you can find them very easily. I won't name any names so I don't leave anybody out, but it's very easy to find them, and they will give you plenty of advice. They got great blogs. This is for your readers. You've already learned the pain. You already know what you're doing now. But if anybody getting started in it, I can guarantee you it's always. Here's what's the frustrating part. It's always your fault. It's you always forgot to configure one little bit here or there on this giant list. And the problem is we shouldn't have had a giant list, but that's just the nature of Ethernet. Nothing can be done automatically. That's the whole point.
Right. Is there plans to do something along the lines of like an Ansible playbook or something that would have all those settings baked in? You could just be, hey, network admin, here's an Ansible playbook that sets up your switches correctly. Go run that.
It's a great question. The software-defined networking stuff, another big feature we released for 2016, might have some of those things in their vision. And SDN is a way of sort of doing Azure data center style networking on your own premises. Obviously, when you set up stuff in Azure, then nobody's running around, setting IP addresses and plugging cables into switches and stuff. You couldn't onboard 10,000, new workloads a day. So it's entirely software based. It's like a flat network with micro-segmented VLANs, like millions of them.
Right.
All through software. So some of that stuff may be possible in the future. And also, it's unfortunate, InfiniBand, which is also made by the same, the originating company of Rocky, the Mellanox company out of Israel, it actually has all the auto configuration and stuff that, kind of makes this all really easy. But of course, it's the more proprietary and more expensive solution, so no one uses it.
Right.
So there's ways to solve this, and there's been a lot of auto, in the V2 scheme of Rocky, the vendors aren't blind to this. They realize that they're hurting themselves. There's been a lot of talk and some early work on making configuration and troubleshooting a lot easier.
I actually worked with a guy that had been part of the team that worked on InfiniBand, and this was back in 2006, I want to say, 2007, and he would not stop talking about how amazing InfiniBand was and how it should have taken over the world.
That's how I always feel about everything I've ever worked on. Nobody wants to admit that they're VHS, Nobody wants to be Betamax or VHS.
Right. That's funny.
No, it's true. We actually run a bunch of InfiniBand stuff here as part of our test loop. We have a Metro X, a couple of Metro X long-haul switches, and we do our own fiber runs and everything. And it's crazy how fast and how good it is and how easy it was to set up. And the only downside was it's just considerably more expensive.
Right.
That was the price you paid.
Well, I guess the money you're saving on not paying for all the SAN software you could use to pay for the InfiniBand. if you really wanted to.
I guess. Stop hiring electricians to run all your, fiber all over the place, I reckon.
I guess. You did mention Crystal Pepsi way back about SMB1. I've actually found Crystal Pepsi in the last year.
Oh, my goodness.
It was at a pizzeria in Northeast Philly. I don't know why they had it.
They still had new Crystal Pep? Like it's still being manufactured?
It looked new. Or maybe it's just been sitting for that long. I don't know.
Is this like made in, El Salvador and somebody forgot to like turn off the factory or something?
I don't know.
Oh, my goodness.
That's just, when you mentioned Crystal Pepsi, that brought me back. I was like, wow, I found that.
I was just trying to reach some of your older listeners like me.
One other thing I want to ask you about was, I know REFS has been out for a little while. I feel like a lot more applications are starting to support it. What are the advantages of REFS, and when would I use that over Ntfs?
That is an excellent question. That team actually used to be a different team here, and then we recently reorged and brought all the storage teams sort of together inside of Windows Server for the first time. Uh-huh. So I used to be sort of, a little insider trivia there for you. It's totally useless. So the team that owns REFS is actually now, people I sit next to in a team meeting as opposed to another team across the campus. REFS is an interesting product. It first came out in Windows 8, and then we sort of behaved as if it had never come out. So we made an announcement. We had a blog post. It's so far back that the blog post is from Sanofsky. And then there was never a line of documentation written on it ever again. And it wasn't that it was a bad product or that nobody wanted you to use it. It's just that it really had no purpose. It was a sort of an experiment that shipped. And, of course, no customer deployed it. And they're like, what is this? Some weird abandoned file system? Yeah, that sounds safe. The version of RFS we have now, sort of paradoxically, is actually called RFS v3. There was some minor work done that revved it once without us really ever telling anybody. And then this version that came out is a reimagining of it. All the core work is still the same. But it's designed to be the modern virtualization file system. So it's not really a good general-purpose file system. It scales much larger than Ntfs, but in many ways it's inappropriate. I mean, it's missing tons and tons of pieces of Ntfs that many apps have built up 30 years of expecting to exist, inside Microsoft and out. Plenty of products don't work with REFS here. If you tried to run, like the file server resource manager and file classification and all those things, they would blow up. If you try to install DFSR and point to an REFS volume, it'll say, this is an Ntfs, what are you doing? So it's ourselves even don't support it widely. But the idea was, what if we tailor this thing for virtualization and then SQL down the road probably? And the idea is that you get extremely fast performance in those types of scenarios. I do a demo. You might have seen a video that's been recorded and shown many times where I take a server, I take the storage and I cut it in half, so to speak. I format a volume on one half of it and another one on the other, and I do Ntfs on one and RFS on the other. So everything's identical except the file system. Nothing else is different. It's a total apples-to-apples test. And then I create a VM, a fixed disk VM, like 256 gig, I think, or 128 gig. And on the Ntfs system, the Ntfs volume, it takes a few minutes. And on the RFS one, it takes under a second. I do the same thing where I merge checkpoints. I actually merging a checkpoints from Hyper-V or restoring a backup are sort of the same thing. And on the Ntfs one, it takes minutes. And on the RFS one, it takes 2 or 3 seconds. Things like that, being able to follow things like super fast VDL extension and not synchronously writing zeros to a file, like things that were good ideas on tiny files in 1993, we just don't do, and we replace them with fast modern programming techniques. It scales much larger. It has much more resiliency than Ntfs. It's much better at detecting problems and correcting them. It's better at making copies of data. It's better at repairing itself. All that stuff is it's just better in every single way. So the goal is that you would use RFS, and in fact the default on a storage basis direct servers data volumes is REFS. So you would use it for Hyper-V and SQL Server 2016.
Okay. And I think the Exchange team either supports it or is working on supporting it as well.
If I could ever know what the Exchange team was up to, I would be a very happy man. I have no idea. I remember somebody came to me at Ignite and said, "Hey, is Exchange support storage replica?" And I said, "Well, what did they tell you?" And they said, "What's storage replica?" So the answer is
sounds
no.
about right. Thumb their nose at it a little bit too.
Well, I mean, the
we've
Exchange
got
team
DAGs.
They have a long history of doing things before other people. I mean, they had before Active Directory, there was Exchange's LDAP server, and before, proper clustering, there was Exchange's proper clustering. They're a pretty cutting-edge team, but also nowadays, they're, as you can tell from each release, they are less and less interested in anybody running them at all.
Yeah.
As opposed to Office 365, right? So their future is probably less. It's even more vague now than it's ever been before, because now they don't even have to release it to show you.
Right. They can just spin it up in Exchange Online and be like, look, it does this now.
There you go. Does some stuff.
Yeah.
Give me money.
I heard in a story, and it may be apocryphal, about the Exchange team back in when Exchange 2007 was being developed. They wanted a better SMTP engine in IIS, and the IIS team didn't have time to develop it or wasn't interested in doing that. So the Exchange teams were like, forget it. We're just going to write our own. And they wrote their own SMTP engine.
Yeah, I don't know that story, but I know that is definitely a pattern that is truthful. I don't know if that particular one is truthful, but they routinely, over history, have done it their way. And then oftentimes they kind of got back out. I mean, Exchange 5.5 had its own LDAP, and then when Active Directory came around, it's like, okay, we're not going to run our own LDAP anymore. We're going to use the Microsoft one. Yeah,
but, much to the pain of Exchange admins who were trying to upgrade. Getting from 5.5 to 2000 was, not terrible, but it was
Well, no, we're back to why I got a job at Microsoft, because the first day I got on the phone, there were like 75 calls holding for that scenario, and it was like 8 in the morning.
Right. I was not at that level yet. I was still working help desk, but I watched our Exchange admin tear his hair out when they decided to move to Windows 2000 and Exchange 2000. I was like, ooh, that seems bad. He doesn't seem to be sleeping.
Well, it could be worse. You could have been like a Novell administrator who was trying to migrate from eDirectory and GroupWise over there. Those were the guys who were really bald.
Oh, that is still happening. We still have prospective clients or clients that had GroupWise, and we're doing our best to get them off.
Wow.
And eDirectory. So it's still out there.
That is... I thought I worked, my last contract I ever did before I went to Microsoft was on a NetWare, 6 dot something deployment for a good-sized regional bank in North Carolina. And the ZenWorks part of it, and I worked on ZenWorks. I did a lot of desktop software deployment and writing deployment systems back then when there weren't any to choose from. And we were trying to use ZenWorks. And we were the beta. And we were one of the only companies in the beta in production. And every time I open a case about a bug, I kept getting the same guy. I'm like, how come I keep talking to you, whatever your name was? And then after a while, I realized that when he was on vacation, I wouldn't get any responses. And then it turned out that he was the developer, the program manager, the tester, and the support at Novell for this one product. I was like, yeah, we might not want to go risk everything on this, because if Bob here quits, I don't know what we're going to do.
Right. That's funny. I've had similar relationships with support people. I'm like, I keep talking to you. Why is that? I just feel it drop out of the pit of my stomach. Oh, man. I don't know about this product. You mentioned a few times hyperconverged and the software-defined data center. It sounds like Server 2016 is really going to help people embrace and accelerate that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the goal that we have, this mantra of the software-defined data center, is that you should be able to stop worrying about not just complex or expensive or proprietary software hardware, but really stop worrying about hardware, period. The difference between the 12 server manufacturers, the actual difference between their servers, which the guts are filled with Intel parts and a handful of networking, in the end, we want it so that our partners can do differentiation, and that we make it so that you have a seamless experience no matter whom you're buying from, so that you can have a vendor that you appreciate for their quality or their price or their support or the aspects that they add on to stuff. But no matter where you go and no matter whom you talk to, the Windows part and the data center will always be the same and be understandable and be reliable and be fast and be inexpensive. Our really big goal here is to take all the lessons we've had over the last, effectively decade of building Azure, either underneath the covers here and then finally shipping it, and take those lessons of us finally using our own products at an enormous scale. I mean, at a scale that really only one or two other companies on Earth are familiar with, and then apply those lessons back down so that on a smaller scale, since none of our customers will ever be as big as Azure probably, or as big as AWS. But there's so many good lessons and so much good work and so many millions of hours of great computer science put to the test and Microsoft research and all those things behind it that it's very advantageous, we think, that you would be able to get away from these purely proprietary vendor solutions for companies that either are very small and may not exist next year, or are very large and have stopped innovating years and years and years ago, especially in the SAN market, where innovation there is to acquire effectively, not to build.
Right.
And then in the end, save a lot of money at no downside in our perfect world. Like, you save a lot of money, but then it's way faster and easier to use. That's our overriding goal.
Right. And the fact that the data center license comes with all of this, you've already probably bought the data center license, so in effect, you've already purchased all these features anyway.
Yeah, our hope is that anybody who's already been, drinking our delicious Kool-Aid for the last 25 years, I mean, who doesn't, in the enterprise world, everybody, and even in the small and medium business world, we're a fairly ubiquitous and obvious thing. You probably already own all this. And the only new payment might be for varying hardware or things that are new pieces of support that we added, or new options we've built together with these vendors. But in the end, you should really only have to choke one vendor, us, if there's problems. That's always my boss's goal, is the one throat to choke is the goal, and he wants it to be our throat.
That's a little disturbing. From if I were you, it would feel a little disturbing. Yeah, and I know that one of the other things that's coming out in the relatively near future is Azure Stack, which is, if you don't want to build it, we built it for you, kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's the ultimate. Yeah, that's the ultimate goal of all this, is to not just have you put together a turnkey solution, but you could actually buy a palletized drop-in solution.
Is there anything coming forward for storage to work better with containers and Windows containers?
Yes. There's a ton of container work being done by the Hyper-V team here, and object storage as well by our team. So blobs, running on premises. We've talked about all these things at Ignite. Containers are actually already shipped to some extent.
Right.
But the Docker story is being firmed up. The container stuff is like the industry of containers itself. It's very old, but also it's a term that nobody knows what it means or what they're for. So it's a sort of a scenario that's still trying to find, a problem to fix for many customers.
Right.
You could argue that people had containers when they first started using mainframes. You could argue that they've had them when they first started using, jail on Unix and stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that covers that territory. Right now, our main goal is to make it a beautiful app platform for .NET, and then third-party, common runtimes and languages like Ruby and Node.js and Java and all those pieces. And the Nano server, for example, is designed to be a really good application platform, with the fact that even though it's not really running very much Microsoft software. So you would have tens of thousands of little container nodes surfacing, and they can come in two forms with us. They can be a traditional container like most operating systems, where they're sharing the kernel and just surfacing a little bit of pieces of the OS to run an individual context application. Or you can do what we really hope you'll run, which are these so-called Hyper-V containers, or containers with virtualization built in, where they actually don't share kernel. They're just incredibly lightweight VMs that are only the container surface of the OS. So they're still very small. They're not nearly as small as a Windows container. They're not nearly as efficient for density, but they're much, much safer, both security and stability-wise. So those are kind of what's been rooting around, and it's still very early time for us. If you dig around on the internet and look for Taylor Brown, he's the owner of all this here at Microsoft. He has a lot of content and a lot of talks, and it's still very much in flux, I think, honestly, about what the future holds in this industry, because it, like anything which, goes into the hype cycle, you're always just a little ways away from the trough of disillusionment. We're getting pretty close to that point right now, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's got to be almost peak hype at this point.
It's got to be really, really close. Got to be close.
Yeah, and I feel like some people are doing containers and doing it in a production scenario, but the bulk of our customers, which are all enterprise and small medium business, they're like, container what? No.
Yeah. The hardest part when I do these sessions where I go back, like I alluded to earlier, talking to CEOs or, directors of IT and stuff, is just trying to explain to them what it is. Like, it's in no way on the roadmap. I've yet to find a customer where it was on a roadmap, period. They really are quite favored in the world of startup software development and open source development, but nobody's getting paid for that. So this is the first time it'll be something interesting where there's no venture capital involved and actual customers are trying to do stuff for themselves. It's a whole new world there.
Right. I feel like once enterprise developers start using it, you might start seeing it, and also you need the tools that enterprise admins will use to back it. So whether that's Hyper-V containers or VMware has their container engine now that kind of does the same sort of, it's not running in an operating system. It has its own little VM that it runs in. That'll make operators and admins feel a little bit better about it.
There's an age gap, too. Honestly, people of my age, people in their mid-40s, have been working on stuff a certain way. And right now they're at the peak of, we're at the peak of our careers, beginning our decline into decrepitude. Versus we have guys on the team here who are 23 or 24 who just came out of MIT or Dartmouth and stuff like that. We tend to hire smart young guys or smart young ladies. And they're like, what? .NET? I mean, it's so old. Why aren't you doing this or that? And, so it's going to be generational as well.
Right. Yeah. No, I'll be joining the 40s this year. And
welcome.
Yeah. Thanks. Love it.
Start waking up with random pain. That's always my favorite thing.
Oh, I look forward to it. All right. Well, I think that's all the questions I have today for you. One last one is, what is your favorite 80s movie?
Oh, I mean, do I have to pick by genre or, like absolute? I mean, that's an impossible question to answer. It's like naming your favorite child.
Absolutely.
All right. So absolute favorite 80s movie. I guess I have to say Empire Strikes Back just to be safe, because that's, the peak of my favorite film grouping, and that's 1980 itself, I think.
Yeah, that 1980. Yeah.
But I love Aliens so much. It's like my favorite action movie of all time. The second one, the Cameron, and then there's Ghostbusters for like favorite comedy.
Yeah.
I really refuse to answer this question.
That's fair.
It may incriminate me.
I think you gave some great examples, though. Awesome. Well, awesome. Ned Pyle, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. If people want to know more about you or where they can find you on the internet, where should they go?
The best place to find me day-to-day is on Twitter. It's at Nerd Pyle, because believe it or not, there was already a Ned Pyle out there squatting on that name.
Wow.
So at Nerd Pyle. We also have a blog, which is aka.ms/server storage. And that covers our full gamut of products and clustering and everything that we make over here in Windows Server.
Great. Sounds good. All right. Thank you very much, Ned. Take care.
Awesome to talk to you too, Ned.
And that was our interview with Ned Pyle. If you enjoyed the Annexapod and are looking for more content, why not check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow? On the show, I am joined by Anexinet colleagues to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. You can subscribe from the iTunes podcast directory or find it on our website. Thanks to Catherine and Patty for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Lee Rosevere and Professor Click for providing the music for Annexapod. Thanks to Anexinet for helping me produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital strategy or technology needs, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet to see how they can help. And finally, thanks to you, dear listener, for tuning in. Without you, I would be a lunatic talking in a room to myself. If you'd like to know more about me and what I am up to, you can check me out on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.